Hello everyone and welcome to this Earth Optimism session about changing diets to combat climate change and protect biodiversity. At Cambridge University, the catering service introduced a sustainable food policy in 2016, which cut the carbon and land footprint of the food served by 1/3. So this was a huge success. My name's Emma Garnett and I'm a researcher in behaviour change and sustainable food. And I'm here with Nick White and Amy Munro-Faure. We've worked together over the past few years around cafeterias and more sustainable food. Over to Nick.
My name is Nick White. I'm the head of the University Catering Service. We operate around 14 cafeterias across the university estate, and we provide catering services to the students and staff and visitors to the university.
Thanks, Emma. I'm Amy Munro-Faure. I am an engagement manager at Cambridge Zero, which is the university's climate change initiative. But prior to that, I was working in the sustainability team and did a lot of work over the last couple of years working with Nick in the catering service and academics such as Emma throughout the university more broadly to try and make a big difference around sustainable food in the university.
Great. Nick, so tell us, what is the sustainable food policy and how did it come about? How did you get involved in this?
Okay, so the university's sustainable food policy sets out the university's intentions to minimise the impact of catering operations on the environment and to promote sustainable practices and consumption. It came about because I've been having lots of conversations with colleagues in the sustainable team quite a few years ago now. And it was suggested that I met with Andrew Barnford, who's the university's Professor of Conservation. So I met with Andrew and he went into great detail about global warming and the impact that food had on global warming. So at that point I said to Andrew, look, the situation is I'm responsible for a fairly significant catering organisation. We clearly want to do what we can. What could we do to help? But bearing in mind that the university does not subsidise catering. So anything that I do has got to be funded from the sales. And Andrew said, well, it's very simple, Nick, really. You need to stop selling ruminant meat. You need to promote plant-based options over meat-based options, stop selling any unsustainable fish and reduce food waste. And that was the 4 pillars that form the basis of our sustainable food policy.
Which has been hugely successful. And so this was quite a big undertaking Andrew had suggested. So what made you want to do it? What was your motivation?
So, as I said, the reason why I've been having a lot of conversations with colleagues in the sustainable team is that back in 2016, the catering service had taken a lot of sustainable actions. We reduced cut waste by introducing compostable vegware. We reduced a number of other things and other initiatives, but clearly there's a lot of things that we could do, and what we needed to do is we needed to kind of focus. And we wanted some academic direction that we could really get our teeth into. So following on from the conversation with Andrew, I remember vividly coming back from his office, walking back to mine and thinking, right, this is what we need to do, but it's going to be a big ask because it's going to be a big sell to chefs, a big sell to the finance team and to the rest of the catering team. But it was one of those things that I felt that, Andrew had clearly demonstrated to me that the global warming was a crisis, and I had a moral obligation to do something about it. So I was determined to do something about it. So that's really what started our journey.
Very inspiring and very powerful words. I think it's very easy for us as citizens to underestimate the effect that food has on the environment. Amy, why are these 4 pillars so important?
That's a really great question, Emma. I'm just going to take them one at a time. So the first one around ruminant meat, there's 2 reasons why I like to... 2 ways that I explain why ruminant meat's important.
For listeners who might not know what ruminant meat is, we're talking about beef and lamb and also goat and buffalo, though those aren't on British menus quite so often.
No, definitely not. Though who knows what may happen in the future, of course. So ruminant meat is important first and foremost because it is a type of meat. And meat in general is a less efficient thing to eat. If you think about it, when you eat a plant, you just eat the plant and you get all the nutrition from that plant. When an animal eats a plant, it eats the plant and then it expends a whole load of that energy on things like moving around, breathing, maybe having offspring, and then the bit of it that's been stored in the animal is what then ends up being your food. So you have a huge inefficiency in between the animal eating the plant, it living its life, and then you eating it. So that's the first bit of it. And now ruminant meat, so as Emma said, that's beef and lamb, mostly in the UK. There's an additional thing, which is they eat an awful lot of grass, and grass is very difficult to digest. So they have a particular type of bacteria in their stomachs, which are a special type of stomach called a rumen. And because of the way that that bacteria works, they release a lot of methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And it's a greenhouse gas that has a much, much stronger warming potential than carbon dioxide that we hear so much about. So those are the two reasons why ruminant meat is really important for global warming or for the climate crisis in general, and that by reducing the amount of ruminant meat that we can reduce those impacts. So I'm going to hand back over to Emma and ask her to talk through, therefore, why eating more plant-based food is going to be really important, and why actually having more interesting plant-based food on the menu might be quite important too.
So Amy's explained fantastically why meat has these higher environmental impacts, and therefore replacing meat with vegetables and whole grains is good for the planet, and it's also good for your health. Even some of the best, lowest impact meat and dairy products still tend to have higher land use, higher carbon emissions, higher water use than the worst plant-based products. And so that's kind of really, really key. And it's also worth remembering in the UK, on average, we overconsume protein, and we're also not getting enough fruit and vegetables and fibre. So it's very fortunate that diets which are good for the planet also tend to be good for our health. Very rich in vegetables and beans and whole grains and flavour, and small amounts of meat, dairy and fish. So increasing plant-based sales can really slash cafeterias' environmental footprint across a whole suite of different indicators. And so that's really key. And then the third pillar, I'll hand back to Amy. So why is choosing sustainable fish so important?
Yeah, I'd like to add just to the end of Emma's point as well there. I think one of the things that I've loved about being involved in this project is, and I think Nick's going to talk more about this, is finding out how excited the chefs had become around finding out about exciting new ways of cooking food and really being creative and exploratory with that, which I just think is great. But moving on to sustainable fish. So the reason why sustainable fish is so important is because historically we have completely over-harvested fish within the world. I think one of the facts that shocked me the most was when I was an undergraduate and I was in a lecture, and one of the lecturers stood up and said, actually the average size of an Atlantic cod used to be this long, you can't even see it on my screen, and now it's substantially shorter than that. And the reason for that is because we've overfished cod so heavily in the Atlantic that the bigger fish have been fished out completely, and only the smaller fish have survived. So we've actually changed what that species looks like, so the adult fish are now substantially smaller than they were 100 years ago because of overfishing, and that just blew my mind. So essentially overfishing has been a huge problem globally, and so what we need to do to try and compensate that is, if we want to eat fish, we need to ensure that we're taking fish from the sea at a rate at which fish can replenish themselves, and that's what buying sustainable fish is all about. It's basically making sure that there are enough fish in the sea that they are able to reproduce and make enough for the next generation that we can have fish to eat in future years. In many ways it's a deeply selfish thing. We're making sure that our children and grandchildren will also be able to eat fish by taking it sustainably and not removing so much fish that they're unable to replenish themselves. And I'm going to now ask Emma to explain why food waste is really important.
So this is the fourth pillar of the sustainable food policy, reducing food waste. Globally, almost a third of food gets wasted, and that's a huge amount. That's a huge amount of land and water and effort and carbon going into making food that never gets eaten. And if this food ends up in landfill and it's breaking down without oxygen, then that will release methane, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas that warms the planet much more than carbon dioxide. And so cutting food waste just makes sense for a whole lot of environmental as well as social reasons. When there are people going hungry who can't afford food, to be wasting it feels very immoral. And also, of course, this is very good for businesses. If you can cut food waste and reduce your expenditure, you have got more profits to spend on other things. So the 4 pillars of the sustainable food policy: 1, removing beef and lamb; 2, promoting plant-based options; 3, serving less fish and only sourcing sustainable fish; and then 4, reducing food waste. So Nick, this is a really ambitious 4 pillars. So what were some of the challenges in introducing this policy, and what was the response from the kitchen staff and the university? A lot of British cuisine still has quite a meat and 2 veg focus. And if you're trying to make a plant-based meal, just taking off the meat and putting on some more carrots doesn't quite work. So how did you navigate this?
Okay, so as I said, coming back from Andrew, and as you've gone into detail, guys, we realised we needed to do these things, and it started with ruminant meat, because that was really going to be the biggest challenge, because chefs' training is largely focused on meat, and from being apprentices all the way through up to head chef, they have spent their entire careers working on meat cookery. It's what's seen as being great catering. So to change the menus wasn't enough. We had to change the philosophy and the culture. And that meant that we had to bring people on board, simply bring people on board. And it wasn't just a case of us saying, well, this is what we need to do. We needed to enthuse them by giving them the opportunity to see what great plant-based food could look like and taste like. So we arranged things like visits to places like Borough Market, which is exciting, dynamic, and offers loads of really fantastic plant-based food options. And they were quite excited about this. So that was the kind of start. We also arranged things like vegan cookery classes for our chefs, which again was a real positive. They came away and with the feeling that actually there's as much skill as doing plant-based cookery as there is in meat-based cookery or fish or any other kind of cookery. And then we kind of said that, look, we want you to take ownership here. So we want these to be your menus, not my menus or the catering manager's menus. So what we want you to do is we want you to go off and research your own dishes, your own plant-based foods, come back, trial them. When you're happy with them, then we'll do our cook tests. We'll all get in, we'll all taste them. And if they pass through the cook test, we'll get them photographed and we make the recipe cards up, and they will then appear on the menus. And that was a really big thing for us because we'd never done it like that before. Traditionally, it's the head chef or the catering manager writes the menus, but now we've got a lot of input from the actual chefs cooking the food on a day-to-day basis. So they liked it, and when they saw their dish on the menu that was being eaten by members of the university, and it was getting positive responses, that of course really helped to enthuse them. So that was the real big thing in terms of like the culture. Then we needed to get our catering supervisors, managers, and also our front of house staff, and that was again through we did lots of events where we got academics to come and present to them to explain why this was important, what the benefits to the university and the wider world would be if we could achieve this. So that helped. Again, we took them to places that sold great plant-based dishes, and that was really interesting. And we also introduced things like choice architecture, which colleagues will go on to explain about later. So we did a whole range of different initiatives, so it wasn't just one thing. So we embraced the culture. We got people to think about plant-based foods as something that's really exciting and the way forward for the future. The next thing, of course, you had to get by the accountants who thought that large numbers of sales were based around meat, particularly the higher value sales, and we were able to say that, look, we need to run a trial. When it comes down to it, we don't know. We are enthused by this, but we don't know what the response from our customers will be. So we did an initial trial. For a period of time, and what we found was that actually people liked it. People kept buying the food. There was, the response was very positive. Nobody complained that there was no ruminant meat on the menus anymore. And of course, the thing about it was that plant-based foods, not all, but most plant-based foods generally are less expensive than meat options. So of course, it didn't hit the bottom line. The sales margins were maintained, the market share was maintained, and the bottom line improved. So the accountants were delighted. So we kind of, pleased everyone. So we were thoroughly excited about it. And on the basis of the initial trial, we then said, no, that's it. We're stopping all ruminant meat. And we did stop all ruminant meat, and that was the way forward. And we've never looked back since.
Wins across the board. It's fantastic. And one of the really interesting things about the sustainable food policy is that you didn't sort of stick up posters everywhere saying no more beef and lamb getting served here, which in some ways, when we see backlash to Meat-Free Mondays, that sometimes advertising and absence can understandably put people's backs up a little bit. So you didn't go for kind of that marketing approach, which did seem to pay off. But of course, it was really important to be communicating and having a two-way conversation with the staff and students. Sort of, Amy, could you talk about how you guys managed that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that there were a number of things that we did, and some of this is work that predecessors of mine were heavily involved with as well, I'd like to add. So I think that before we did this trial as well, one thing that was important is we had a student who came in and did a survey of 120 of the University Catering Service customers and just asked them about their attitudes to some of these questions. And I'm not going to go into detail of all the results, but the one that really stands out for me is that, that 63.6% of customers were open to reducing their meat consumption. And I think that kind of thing gave us a sort of platform from which to say, actually, this is a reasonable thing to do for our customers, and it will actually be serving their needs and wants to go ahead and do this. This isn't something that's hugely counter to what our customers are already looking for in these cafes. So I think that was really important. And in terms of cooperation and communication more broadly, I think that was really important across a number of levels. And the university, I often talk about the university as a little microcosm of society. You have as many different people almost in the university as you do in a society more broadly. It's just a bit smaller. And so I think that we communicated at a number of levels. I think Nick's mentioned talking to Andrew, but I think that we engaged with actually a number of academics at that level to make sure that what we were doing really did have a basis in evidence, and that this was something that was actually going to make a difference. I think we also engaged with the university sort of policy hierarchy. So the policy was analysed by our environmental sustainability committee, and they actually gave it a really rigorous talking through and made sure that the numbers really added up. And of course, we engaged through the survey, but we also talked an awful lot to students. So that was largely through the Green Officer Network. So this really spurred on Green Officers to start asking more questions of their own colleges, of what's going on around food in college. But also allowed us to get their take on what they thought. And in general, that take was exceedingly positive. I should also add that an awful lot of the background work to this, the developing the evidence base, trying to understand what the footprint of food in the university looks like, was also done explicitly by students. So a lot of that research work was obviously in a supervised way, but was done by students who were really, really interested in this. And so when we talk about doing it by stealth, it's not that it was a secret, it was just that it wasn't massively marketed and publicised, and I think that was really powerful. I think it was very much progressed through really having conversations with people and ensuring that what we were doing matched up to what the customers wanted, and I think that was really valuable. And I think another really interesting element of it, which sort of speaks to that trying to really understand what people want from the University Catering Service and to make changes that are in sync with how people think, is the thing that Nick's already mentioned, which is about choice architecture. So I'm just going to hand over to Emma to talk through that, because it's very much her research and her baby, but over to Emma.
Yes, so it's all very well informing people, saying, right, here is the right thing to do. And choice architecture refers to the fact that our physical environment, our economic environment, our social environment, it really affects the decisions we make. So thinking of an example with transport, that if there's a safe bike lane near to your house, going to your work or school, you're perhaps more likely to take the bike than if that's not there. If there's you've got to share a road with cars going very fast. And so our local environment influences the decisions we make. And so what the sustainable food policy did with, providing more vegan and vegetarian options, which had been road tested and were tasty and appealing, and they were nearest the entrance, and the meat options were quite a lot further away. So all of this really clever thinking that Nick and his chef sort of put into it really encouraged and increased vegan and vegetarian sales, which is really, really important. And we live in the UK, just sort of meat is everywhere. It's in a very meat-heavy culture. And I think the survey result that Amy says, like 2/3 of the people they surveyed are interested in reducing their meat consumption. So just creating a cafeteria where that's possible, where that's encouraged, where a vegetarian option, there's not just one, and it's not just an afterthought, that a lot of care and thought and attention to detail has gone into that. And that's really key. So instead of just having an information campaign with perhaps a few labels saying, this pasta in a watery tomato sauce is better for the environment, but that might not convince people to try that if they don't think it's good value for money, or there's still 3 or 4 different meat and fish options. And so thinking about how can we make the sustainable choice tasty, easy, affordable, convenient, so that for individual citizens, it's not an uphill struggle trying to make a sustainable food choice. And I think that's for me, one of the most exciting things about the sustainable food policy, that Nick and others did all that legwork, did all that hard work, just to make it easier for the cafeteria visitors to have a tasty and sustainable option. So we've talked a lot about the taking beef and lamb off the menu, and that was something that had a lot of attention paid to it. But of course, there was also the sourcing sustainable fish and reducing food waste. So Nick, could you tell us a little bit about what the University Catering Service did to realise these pillars?
Sure. So sustainable fish was significantly easier, to be honest, than ruminant meat. Most of it was about substituting. So, for example, when we do fish and chips on Friday in multiple outlets, instead of using unsustainable cod and haddock, we switched to sustainable hake. A straightforward switch, which is really, really easy to do. Some of the more complex issues were around things like, baked potato fillings, bread fillings, and those, again, we utilised the fact that we were promoting more plant-based options, really. So instead of using unsustainable prawns or salmon or whatever, we were substituting with more plant-based options. So that kind of did that kind of aspect of it. And again, it worked pretty well, largely because we were promoting more and more plant-based options. And the overall consumption of plant-based options went up above 50% over every other option. So it became easier and easier. Obviously, you had to constantly research new innovative fillings for baked potatoes and sandwiches and things. But we now were in this kind of, people were enthused about it. So people liked going off researching new sandwich fillings and baked potato fillings. So it worked really well for us. In relation to food waste is fairly complex in as much as there's that of which you have control over, which is prep waste, and that of which you have less control over, which is plate waste. So prep waste is all about food production management techniques, volume forecasting, portion control, making sure that you don't overorder, for example, or serve bigger portions than you should do. A lot of that is relatively straightforward and relatively easy to control for the caterer. Obviously, plate waste, again, things like serving food on smaller plates, for example, was very successful because we served exactly the same portion that we did before, or slightly smaller in some cases, reducing the selling price, which again gave the perception of value for money, but people didn't really query the fact that it was a small portion because the perception was it was the same size. We stopped a lot of self-help stuff. Things like salad bars, we kind of phasing those kind of out. Never been a fan of salad bars for food safety reasons, and the only good thing that will come out of COVID is the fact that they'll probably be banned forever. But the thing is that people tend to eat as much as you can is doesn't sit well with sustainability, really. So, you want to offer very good value for money, fair prices for good quality food, but you need some kind of control over it so you avoid waste food, because, as colleagues have said, the last thing we want is to throw food into landfill. So these initiatives helped significantly and made a big difference for us.
Yeah, fantastic. So the Sustainable Food Policy, it was introduced in 2016, and then in 2019 the University Catering Service published a report doing the analyses to see what the effects had been. So Nick and Amy, what were the findings from this report?
Well, from my perspective, the findings of the report were that it demonstrated that what we'd set out to achieve, we did achieve, albeit it's just the first chapter in a long journey. It's certainly not the end of what we're going to be doing. We ceased selling ruminant meat. We ceased selling unsustainable fish. We massively promoted plant-based options over other options, and we reduced food waste to a certain extent. So we did that, and the academic support demonstrated that made significant CO2 savings and land use and water use, which was fantastic. It also demonstrated that we were able to do that without impacting on our operations, without impacting on our financial performance. We maintained our market share, increased sales, and we increased our bottom line. So more than anything else, it demonstrated to us that you can achieve sustainability without damaging your business and without preaching to people. So from where I sat, it was a great success.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with Nick on that. I think for me, I think this report was really interesting because I think that after the Sustainable Food Policy had been running for a couple of years, the sort of obvious next question was, has it worked? Have you actually changed anything by doing this? And so I think that this report was really an attempt to answer that question. And I was really lucky to be involved in it, that we got a couple of really brilliant recent grads to come in and essentially to work through what the footprint of the catering service had looked like before the introduction of the Sustainable Food Policy, and after the introduction of the Sustainable Food Policy, and we compared the same 3-month period before and after. And these two grads, Anya and Sophie, both did a fantastic job. They went through all of the invoices for all of the food that had been purchased in the period before and the period that had been purchased afterwards, and worked out from the best available evidence what the life cycle emissions of those foods would be based on the weight of all the food that had been bought. And then we found this really fantastic result that if you think about it in a relative way, the per kilo of food, the emissions of the catering service had reduced by 33%, and if you think about it in an absolute way, that had been reduced by 10.5%, which is pretty astounding given the fact that, as Nick said, the business grew over that period and profits went up. And I think this was a real vindication for the work that had been done, and a really, really fantastic piece of work. And I got to work with two really inspiring, great young people who worked really hard to make it happen.
Nick, one of the many reasons I find you so inspiring, like many people having achieved what you and your team have done would rest on their laurels, but you're keen to go further. You have 101 different things to think about, and you still manage to prioritise sustainability. Whereas Amy and I, our jobs is to think about sustainability. We don't need to think about, fixing coffee machines and ordering in huge quantities of food. And so that is just remarkable. So, yeah, what's motivating you to go even further, or what can we expect next?
Okay, so obviously, as I said before, we were thrilled when the Sustainable Food Journey was published because it kind of supported the actions that we've taken so far. But it really was just the start of the journey. It is the start of the journey, and the journey will continue. So we will be working with colleagues in our sustainability team and our academics to actually work on the next set of initiatives. Because one of the things that we really felt was that the first part of the journey kind of completed with the Sustainable Food Journey publication. But as that came out, people became aware of it. I spent a lot of time talking to college catering managers, working with college catering managers and other organisations that were interested in what we'd done. And they kind of realised that it is achievable. So because of that, many people adopted the University Sustainable Food Policy, did their own versions of it. Some, did something very similar, and so it had got traction. The genie was out of the bottle, it was never going to go back, and so on the basis of that we knew that we had something that was great that we would continue, and of course it didn't impact negatively on our business. It's what our students told us they wanted, it's what the university wanted, it sits in what the university is trying to do on a global level, and so we're carrying on, and we're going to do bigger and better things with a lot of new and exciting things to come.
I'm feeling optimistic that these big changes can happen, as you say, Nick, when people pull together, when the genie is out of the bottle, and when people have the determination and vision to do something that hasn't quite been done in that way before, and saying, well, no, I'm gonna do that. And Nick and your team and the University Catering Service have been real trailblazers in this space. And so just to wrap up, I think it's really important for us all to remember, policymakers are everywhere. I think when we hear the term policymaker, we think of someone in a suit in London, in Westminster, Houses of Parliament, sort of civil servants. But I would argue if you make a decision that affects other people outside of your household, you are a policymaker. You're really important. If you get to decide our company is going to be using a renewable energy supplier, if you get to decide our organisation's pensions are not going to be invested in fossil fuels, if you are setting menus for other people, you are a policymaker like Nick, and you can make a big difference. And I think that's a really important reason to be optimistic. And that we've seen these ripple effects from the sustainable food policy has started many conversations and actions from other organisations. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.